Well, it's Friday morning, and we get to witness the brilliance of Joti Brar. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here with Joti Brar. It's Friday morning, and there's one or two things going on. Of course, we have the current issues in Ukraine and Israel. We have the political upheaval, the Paris in throughout Europe, the Paris Olympics, and the cultural issues that are being discussed there, and of course Venezuela, where the imperialists are up to their usual shenanigans. Let's actually start with Venezuela, a place that is near and dear to my heart, because that's where it's most obvious what they're up to right now. It's the latest thing. Certainly prior to the election, the U.S. empire pushed the far right-wing fascists. And of course, they lost. The people in Venezuela did what they, as they'll tell you to, if you talk to them, we're willing to stand up and fight for our democracy, and we're Chavistas and blah blah blah. Okay, and we went back. Now we're back to Juan Guaido. The U.S. empire now said, I guess they chose one of the random right-wing fascists and said, that's the real president. Clearly, they would have won by 40%. I like that number. They would have won by 40% if not for all of the political shenanigans. And here we are, back to the beginning, back to Juan Guaido, the latest iteration of Juan Guaido in Venezuela. Your thoughts about the Venezuela elections and the imperialist controversy surrounding it?
It's really interesting watching Venezuela's Bolivarian process, because you have kind of two state machineries almost running in parallel in Venezuela. You have a growing machinery of a working class state, but you still have all this machinery of a bourgeois capitalist state, and they run simultaneously. Now, these elections are essentially bourgeois capitalist elections, and they have all the problems that arise from trying to fight, even when you have the masses on your side, through a bourgeois electoral system. Because, for one thing, the mass media in Venezuela is in the hands of the class enemy. It's in the hands of oligarchs who are aligned with US imperialism, and they have a tremendous impact on the mindset of a lot of people in Venezuela, particularly when you combine that with the fact that a lot of, or majority of, the means of production are still in the hands of the oligarchs and US imperialist aligned forces, which means that the economy can be used to make people suffer, and then the media can tell everybody that the suffering is because of the Maduro and previously the Chavez government, right? So because it's still a capitalist economy, because it's still majorly in the hands of the old ruling class and the imperialist masters from abroad, they have the ability to bring hardship to the people. The hardship doesn't only come from sanctions imposed from outside, it also comes from manipulations of the economy within the country. And much as the government tries to fight this, there's a limit to what they can do without actually dispossessing those oligarchs, taking the media out of their hands, taking all the factories and farms out of their hands, and running a planned economy for the benefit of the people is really the only way you can properly solve these problems. What Venezuela has is a kind of halfway house. They have this tremendous program. I always forget its name. Is it the CLAP? C-L-A-P?
I think it's CLEP, C-L-E-P, or something like that. Yeah.
So essentially, it's a rationing system, which basically means that no matter what the imperialists do, people do not starve. So everybody has basic rations for survival. They're also provided with many things for free or nearly free in terms of basic services like electricity, telephony, water, all the rest of it. You wouldn't believe that how many things Venezuelans get for nearly for nothing from the state. In order to make sure they can live. But they can't really prosper in the current situation. Most of them. It's very, very difficult. It's been an incredibly tough time with all these interventions economically and the strangulation of sanctions, which is a collective punishment. It's a punishment to the people for sticking by their revolutionary process. It's a punishment that's aimed at making them give up on their chosen leadership and submit to the diktat of capital. And they haven't yet done that. But there's a lot of efforts to make that happen, of course. And so these difficulties are manufactured and then manipulated by the oligarchs, by the media, in order to make the sufferings of the people worse and present them as some kind of mismanagement. And of course, that's how it's always presented to Western viewers or commentators or readers or whatever, that the chaos, the economic difficulties in Venezuela are to do with the government being unpopular, total lie, to do with the government being incompetent and somehow mismanaging its funds, total lie. Of course, it's all been completely manipulated. And the mass of Venezuelan people have shown that they understand that. Because as you said, if you go to Venezuela and meet poor working class people, they are so proud of their process. They are so proud that they have made themselves, or are in the process of making themselves, sovereign, that they will not be cowed by imperialism. Ordinary working class people have very militant anti-imperialist slogans on their lips daily. And it's not a kind of forced, activity. This really shows the depth of the revolutionary process, but also of the support for the revolution. It's amongst the poorest communities where you feel it the most. And the masses of Venezuelan people, when you go there, you see that they really are in support of the revolution. And you see how the revolution tries to empower them, despite all the difficulties, to solve their problems themselves. So they have local commune committees where whole neighborhoods get together, discuss what their problems are, come up with plans how they could try and address them, ask the government for help that's available. There's a whole process of trying to facilitate people to feel like they're actors in their own lives. It's complete opposite of what we have in the West when it comes to engagement in social life and political life and economic life, And on the other side, one of the ways you can see the real support of the process, the Bolivarian process in Venezuela, is how the people have fundamentally been armed. One of the main reasons the US has consistently failed to carry out coups in Venezuela is because after the first failed coup, where they nearly succeeded, and they kidnapped Hugo Chavez, and then he was brought back again, the first thing that happened after that was the army was reconstituted on a popular basis. And now the army is one of the pillars of the Bolivarian revolution. And that's one of the main reasons, they try sometimes. I saw a clip that was circulating on social media this week that showed supposedly two Venezuelan generals calling for the army to rebel. And the Western media present this as if there's a mutiny in the ranks of the army. There's not. When you look a bit closer, you discover that those generals are living in exile. They're not in the army today. They're former army officers who are living somewhere else, and the US has put a uniform on them and put them in front of a camera, and they're calling on the army to. But apart from for propaganda purposes to outsiders, what impact do you think those non-resident ex-generals are going to have on the actual soldiers in Venezuela? I mean, I should think it would have the reverse effect of the one intended if it comes to stirring up a rebellion. Clearly, the army remains on the side of the people, remains on the side of the Bolivarian revolution. And not only that, there's been an arming of the popular masses, which again shows you that it's a popular government. Because no minority government that's trying to control a population that doesn't like it arms the people. No bourgeois government arms the people. This is the sign of a revolutionary popular government, that it has armed and trained the people in local militias to defend themselves against the interference of the imperialists. And you can meet those militias on the streets. They're very friendly. They're not an occupation force. They're a popular local force. And that's one of the ways in which you can see what a positive and popular process this is, despite all the difficulties that have come to the people of Venezuela because of sanctions. And just finally to add, I think I talked to you about this when I came back from Venezuela. I guess it was more than a year ago now, on my last visit there. But my sense about the difficulties in Venezuela, the economic difficulties, is they are actually starting to lessen. The consequence of, BRICS alignment, deals with Iran, with Russia, I'm sure increasingly with China, mean that Venezuela is starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. The sun is coming up over the horizon, if you like, for the future of Venezuela. So sanctions are going to become an increasingly impotent weapon of the West. They've been used to great effect to isolate and strangle countries over the last 30 years, but they are going to be less and less effective in the coming period. And I had a sense of the people I met there a year ago that they could sense that too, even though it wasn't like the cavalry had arrived and everything was better, but the cavalry was on the way. And you had that sense of relief that, the multipolar world that's rising, the circumventing of the sanctions measures is beginning to be, a real thing in the world, and that is going to change everything for the Venezuelan people. So my view of what's happened recently in this election is it's the standard operating manual of the imperialists, to start calling into question the outcome of an election a few weeks ahead, so that the narrative that they spring on people the day after the election, or even the day of the election, that this was not free or fair and it's been manipulated. And look, our poll said that it was going to be this result, but it hasn't been. So clearly someone's messed around. This narrative has been set up for weeks in advance, and now they're trying to unleash it. They've done what they can to unleash violence on the streets. We have a comrade who's been over there during the election process. According to the vast majority of election monitors who were there, it was totally free and fair. To be honest, if you're going to fix an election, you don't fix your win at 51%.
Right.
If you've got all this power over the process, you'd fix it at least 60 or 70, wouldn't you? Not 51. I think that 51 doesn't reflect the depth, actually, of support for the revolution across Venezuela. It does reflect how many people that USA is able to brainwash and mobilize, even inside Venezuela, even today, because of all the pressures they put on, because of all the images and lies that come in the media to the kind of Venezuelan middle class, and the hopes they have that life will just get easy if they do as they're told.
A perfect example is Paul Kagame, the African, U.S. imperialist stooge. He just won his second election in a row. He won in 2017, 99% of the vote. This time, 98.8% of the vote. But that was perfectly okay. That was the U.S. supported that.
Victory for democracy.
Exactly. Now, let me ask you one other thing. Something that I picked up that I haven't heard a lot of people discuss regarding Venezuela's revolutionary mindset, right? Let me give you the example. If you're in a given country and you look and all of the animals suddenly go running by in one direction, or the wild animals, the monkeys, the other ones that are normally, preying on each other, they're all running in the same direction, right? You're probably not going to look at the direction they're running to. You're not going to say, gee, I wonder where they're going. You're going to look in the direction they're running from and say, what the hell are they running from? I think I better go in that direction. Is it a tsunami, earthquake? Okay, you get my metaphor. Here's my point. I found that when I was in Venezuela, a big part of the discussion, A, was the revolution and they supported the revolution, but B was this, what they were running from, the reason for the revolution. That I talked to people in little towns way out in the mountains, right? They talked about neoliberal capitalism and neoliberalism. They talked about their experience, and some of them, the younger ones who weren't even alive, their parents and their grandparents experienced under neoliberalism, the violence that they suffered, the pain that they suffered, there were things available that aren't available now, but we were poorer then than we are under the sanctions. Then Chavez came in, we couldn't get into the city. He built these big overhead trolley things, right, that came from the mountains into the city so we could come in and work and shop and things like that on the big cable cars, right, that were free. So the other part that they talk about is, look, we know what the alternative is. So we discuss the revolution and what they have and what they're trying to protect. But the reality is, what motivates them is they know the reality of what they're running from. Your thoughts?
That's absolutely right. And it's to the great credit of Hugo Chavez's leadership that has been continued now for a decade by President Maduro that they have not shied away from educating their population and allowing socialist ideas to really spread and take hold and become very, very popular, despite not being a kind of classic Marxist-Leninist type of communist type of a party. Clearly they identify themselves with socialism, with the idea of a socialist future as one that they continually talk about working towards. And you can see how this is a mass phenomenon and not just a leadership garnish by the way the people talk. And it's not just their slogans. I've told you this story before, but I'm going to tell it again because you'll have forgotten and there'll be lots of people watching who haven't heard it before. So apologies to those who have, but it's something that really hit me at the time and stayed with me. I was visiting a housing commune about an hour outside of Caracas, a poor area, very working class. And this housing commune had problems because everything was built from concrete. And so it got to a certain point in the building program and had to stop. Well, they didn't manage to finish the project because of the sanctions that stopped concrete coming into the country. And there was lots of discussion about alternative means of building without concrete. But anyway, we had a meeting there. I was there with the World Anti-Imperialist Platform, and we met leaders and members of the community. And the lady who was chairing the sort of welcome rally they held for us was clearly a local, salt of the earth, working class grandmother, a real abuela, poor working class leader. You could see in her face that she's lived a real life, just little grandma, but tough as anything, right? And these are the people the revolution rests on, actually. It's the grandmas who've done everything and hold their communities together. And they also have this fighting spirit that's just really phenomenal. And I heard in my Spanish was just good enough for me to pick out of her speech a phrase of Marx's, Karl Marx. And she said, I can't remember it in Spanish, but she said it in Spanish. And I was like, oh my God, I know what she's saying. She said, theory becomes a material force when it is gripped by the masses. Right? This is something we tell our cadres in our study classes all the time. The importance not just of studying Marxism, but of working out how to connect it to the mass movement. Because once the masses pick up this ideology, this understanding of the world, they will change everything, right? And it was so phenomenal for me to hear this, old poor lady from a backwater of Venezuela saying this and living the truth of it and showing us with the life of the commune that she was part of, just, community, that they understand this essence and they bring it to their daily lives, their daily struggles, their understanding of what it is they're fighting for and why.
Wow. Let me just get I would like to get a comment on your thoughts on the Paris Olympics. It opens and they got this weird stuff, some naked blue guy running around singing, just weird stuff. I'm thinking, he's naked and he's blue. What is that? It just seems weird to me. But at any rate, and you've got a controversy with a person are they trans? Are they, I don't know. So that discussion's about that, a boxing discussion. It's interesting that there's such a cultural confusion and discussion. And there are people that are literally disgusted by what's going on at the Paris Olympics. And of course, there's a liberal class saying it's all wonderful. It's just weird to me. But your thought, do you have any, you don't have to, do you have any thoughts on this weird, what seems to be a cultural debacle?
You know, it's funny, and you make me feel bad because I had a comrade who was like, you should talk about this with Garland. You've got to watch that opening ceremony. And I was like, I've seen enough clips to feel like I really don't want to watch that. Like, it looks like torture to sit through that whole thing. And I did promise him I would, and I haven't yet. But I've seen quite a few of the clips that are circulating. And okay, you can say, well, that's taken out of context. That's taken in the whole thing. It all makes sense, right? But to me, the clips that I saw of like the naked blue guy, the apparently drag queens seeming to do this Last Supper, you know, this whole this is supposed to be showing us the best of France, right? What is it actually showing us?
It might actually be, look, it may be that France is so bad that that is the best of France. That's the horrible part of it.
France has produced wonderful arts, literature, and culture in its history, right? If this represents the modern French regime, and to be fair, I think it probably does represent the outlook and the thinking of the modern French regime, all that tells you is imperialism is in its last days. It is utterly decadent. It is utterly decayed. It has nothing real or meaningful to offer the people. If you look at bourgeois art, you know, from the early days after capitalist revolutions happened, it's all totally realistic. A comrade of mine posted we were having a kind of cultural type chat in one of my party groups recently, and someone posted there, you know, Oliver Cromwell, who was the leader of the English Revolution, when he was painted straight after that revolution, he said, paint me warts and all, you know, famously had a kind of warty face. You know, it was this desire for art to represent reality because it's a revolutionary class is optimistic about itself, about its destiny, about the future. It believes in unleashing the power of science to explore and discover things about the world. It believes in representing positively reality and the prospects for the future. And that's why the heyday of all imperialist countries' art is right after their revolution. And the kind of 100 years following, you see realism, you see incredible detail, you see wonderful perfection of technique in the service of reality, in the service of showing people a kind of wonderful reflection of real things in the real world. And as the society becomes more and more decadent, its art has less and less connection with and is less and less able to reflect reality. And when it does have any reflection of reality, it's kind of monstrous, you know, because the artist can't find anything positive to say or to show. So to be honest with you, when I look at that whole Paris debacle, that's what I see. And I think something else that just has to be mentioned in relation to Paris is this, you know, on the one hand, to represent the great arts of the Western civilization, they have this decadent display that shows nothing, that means anything to anybody, apart from, like I say, decadence, decay, corruption, senility. You know, you could put Biden in the middle of that and it would all make perfect sense, you know. And then, but on the other hand, when it comes to as a sporting event, you have, you know, on the one hand, it's supposed to be the world comes together through sport, but who's banned? Russia and Belarus. And who is not banned? Israel. And all I see around my bit of the internet, which is obviously full of left-wing political people, is blood-soaked memes about the Olympics, to be honest. It's disgusted the world that there's not a single institution that is prepared to stand up against Israeli genocide. Not in sports, not in music, not in culture, not anywhere is there an institutional objection on the international scale that says, hang on a minute, we can't be condoning this, we can't be going along with it, we can't be normalizing it by having Israeli teams turn up as if nothing's going on and we're all just friends together. And at the very same time, they're banning and othering Russia and Ukraine, not Ukraine, Belarus, for standing up for themselves, which is what the Russians have done. Russia did not break any laws. Russia did not aggress against anybody. Russia has made a massive point of not attacking civilians in Ukraine. You'd really know about it if they had been. The Western media tries to make up the odd story that they are, but it's obviously nonsense. And they're very sort of kind of few and far between pathetic attempts, because it's not true, right? The Russian special military operation in Ukraine has been conducted along very careful and self-defensive lines to liberate the people of the Donbass from a fascist regime and to prevent this further threat, because Ukraine's being used as a battering ram against Russia, etc., etc. We don't have to go into all of that, but my point is the incredible hypocrisy. Like, even if you believe all the allegations against Russia and Belarus, which are totally manufactured, if that's a justification for excluding Russia and Belarus from the Olympics, and the Olympic organizers are acting on a point of principle, what the hell is Israel doing there? And as soon as they let Israel be there, they blow all their own arguments out of the water completely. And then they cause people to say, well, but if you really cared about these things, there's no way you could normalize Israel's activity. And if you're able to make that double standard, maybe I also don't have to trust you when you tell me about Russia and Belarus.
Israel. Recently, we've had a couple of things. Benjamin Netanyahu comes to Washington, D.C. What's interesting is the people of the United States are outside. The people are screaming, the genocidal monster, blah, blah, blah. And inside, I'm not going to call them leaders because they're not, but the representatives of the ruling class are basically people count the number of standing ovations. I say it was one standing ovation. Count the number of times they sit down. It was a one long standing ovation with some pauses occasionally where they would take a seat. But for the most part, the guy comes in the midst of a genocide, and they went out of their way to show their support for him. Now he goes right back and they're doing what they do, And what's interesting is this, that at the time we're being told, the usual, Ukraine's winning and Israel's winning and they're a, moral, they've got the moral high ground, etc. They're losing. They're getting pummeled. They're acting out of desperation. And the internally complete and total moral collapse. They've got gang raping people, and the riot they have in Israel now is the fear, the unthinkable fear that people who committed a gang rape against prisoners may be held accountable. So you've got a political collapse. What's left of any morality is completely, totally collapsed. Israel, it's like the Israel, if I consider that the external or the far reaches of the U.S. empire, it's like collapsing on the far reach. If you have like an empire and you have the outside of it, say Ukraine and Israel, they're proxies. They are both in complete and total collapse. I read where a woman recently in Ukraine lit herself on fire because they took her husband. They were literally just kidnapping Ukrainians and throwing them in there. The Ukrainian people can't come out and say, oh my God, we don't like this. They are just completely and total hostage. Anyway, your thoughts on all of this, Joti?
You're absolutely right, Garland. In both cases, you have a social, economic collapse taking place before our eyes. With Netanyahu's speech to the US Congress, I actually sent a note to myself this morning because I keep thinking a bit and forgetting it again. I am going to ask one of my comrades to just go through. It's a really boring job because it was just an absolute tissue of lies. And I want to produce just a list of what all the lies were and how we know that they're lies, just because I think it was more lie than anything, And essentially, when you look at that, what you see is the public relations faces for the system practicing their lines. Netanyahu is feeding them this week's things we say when we're asked, but how can you support all these crimes, right? And they all, yeah, and they're memorizing their lines, right? I'm sure they all went away and rehearsed some of them, because of the same talking points you hear over and over and over again. I skim read it. I didn't read it very properly, but one thing that jumped out at me was his assertion that Israel is delivering aid to Gaza. I mean, could you get more of a slap in the face to the people who are starving to death right now than such an assertion? And the fact that all the people in that hall who stood there clapping like seals will go away and feel confident to repeat that to mass media outlets who will reprint it without a question mark, without saying, I don't know about you, because one of the jobs I wanted to do, Garland, and I haven't done it yet, apologies, was to go around some of the mainstream media and have a look. How many of them, when they reported Netanyahu's speech, said that any of what he was saying is actually under question? Because I have a feeling that they don't do that. They just report it. Like, these were the things Netanyahu said. And like that's that. The report that I saw, certainly that's how it presented it. These are the things Netanyahu said. On the other hand, I read an obituary for Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, who was killed in Iran this week, in the London Times. And it referred to, it was so disgusting. In 2 paragraphs, I just wanted to vomit, because it referred to October 7th as an operation where Hamas, not the Palestinian Resistance Forces, and a whole bunch of random people who came out of Gaza behind them, butchered 1,200 Israelis. That was the word it used. It butchered 1,200 Israelis. Now, the Israeli forces themselves had admitted that most of the people killed on that day were killed by Israeli forces. And yet the London Times is still repeating on a daily basis that the Palestinian resistance, Hamas, as they insist on calling all the resistance forces, butchered 1,200 Israelis. So no context of 76 years and the ongoing resistance, no mention of the fact they have the right to resist, including by arms, no mention of the fact that most of the targets of the resistance were basically military targets. And when it came to civilians, they weren't trying to kill them, they were trying to capture them. Why? We know why. It's the only way they can get some leverage to have all of their hostages released. There are tens of thousands of Palestinians locked away, many of them children, just civilians, picked up off the street, locked away in Israeli dungeons. And the only way that Palestinians have ever succeeded in having their prisoners released is by getting Israeli hostages to swap. That was the main function of that operation as far as the resistance was concerned. It was very clear, and it's very important. And the Israelis themselves tried to sabotage that aim by killing their own people so they couldn't be taken hostage. The Israeli army's own inquiry has released that information to the public. There's no way the editors of the Times don't know that. But they still say the resistance butchered 1,200 Israelis. So total lies, right? And then they talked about the death toll in Gaza. They used the official figures that come from the health ministry in Gaza, which have now been shown by the Lancet to be a huge, massive understatement of the truth. Again, there's no way the Times doesn't know that. But the Times reported the Gaza health ministry figure like this. There might, the war in Gaza, in which as many as 38,000 people might have died. Just died. So they know it's like 3-4 times as many as that, maybe more. Could be as much as 1/10 of the population. They know all that. It's in the public domain. They stick to the lowest possible figure they can report and then present it as probably questionable because it came from the Hamas health ministry in Gaza. They actually said that at one point. So this might be true, but you can't necessarily rely on it. And not that they've been killed by Israel in a war crime, in a massive bombardment of penned up civilians. They might have died. And just in those few paragraphs, the way those numbers were presented were really, really telling. So disgusting. And yet you see the operation to keep trying to put a veneer on the hideous mask of imperialism in the Middle East, of Zionism and its atrocities, its genocidal intent, its supremacist ideology, to try to cover all it over with respectable phrases and with the planting of constant seeds of doubt, the constant repeating of stories that have been debunked ever since the very early days. I mean, the Grey Zone was debunking every one of the lies the Israelis were telling within the first week. And that's all of their analysis has been upheld by stuff that's later been printed in Western and Israeli media. None of the papers ever put that on the front page or the cover of their website as a top story. They never retract what they put. And politicians and media keep repeating the same lies, even though they've all been debunked, and it's like they just create this little environment, which for the people who don't step outside the media bubble, for the people who still trust politicians, who still trust mainstream media, that's the echo chamber that they live in. Those are the headlines they see. Those are the talking points of the people who are invited onto the chat shows. And so there's this attempt to try to stop people from waking up to the reality of what's going on. But it's a futile attempt because it's absolutely flying in the face of all real evidence. And of course, for the people who are stepping outside of the media bubble, it is just accelerating the process of their development from people who were a little bit cynical to people who are really opposed to the entire status quo because they see its utter rank criminality and hypocrisy for what it is. And the more that they keep repeating these debunked lies, the more people see that they've been debunked and see that they're still lying, the less legitimacy our politicians and their entire system that they are fronting for have in the eyes of the people. And you are seeing this with Ukraine as well as with Israel. Max Blumenthal put a little piece on Twitter, which I copied and put onto our party's website because I thought it really got to the heart of the matter when he talked about how in Israel, the extent of the decay of their society can be seen from the fact that the civilians went on a riot, on a rampage to defend the right of their soldiers to gang rape incapacitated prisoners. And these are the people who walk around the world saying we're the most moral army in the world and we're the only democracy in the Middle East. And, they are making, internationally, they're making pariahs of themselves. But in their own state, all they are doing is accelerating their own demise, actually, with every step that they take to try to reassert themselves as, the Zionist entity. It's going nowhere. It's going nowhere fast. Well, it's going down the tubes fast, I would say. But with Ukraine, we're seeing something similar. You said about how the difficulties Ukrainian people have in really organizing themselves against the regime. But what you are seeing is a growing movement of people or sporadic but growing in number attacks on the recruitment officers. They've had this new recruitment laws come in, and now every man between the age of 18 and 60, I think, or 65, has to register with the military commission and have papers on him at all times to say that he's registered. And people don't trust the commission. So they've been caught loads of times taking bribes. If you've got enough money, you can buy your way out of being enlisted. If you don't, even if you have a reason not to be enlisted, you can't trust them not to just kidnap you because they're clearly working under incentives to get people to the front. And increasingly, the people of Ukraine, anyone who felt committed or ideologically motivated to fight for Ukraine as it is today, this puppet state of the West, ruled by fascists and proxies, anybody who felt some allegiance to that state went to the front a long time ago. The people who are left don't want to fight for Ukraine and increasingly see being enlisted just simply as a death warrant. And so what you're seeing is people either hiding from the recruiters, trying to get out of the country, trying to find money for bribes to either pay off the recruiters or get out of the country or both. And you're seeing a rise in the number of attacks on recruitment gangs. So this is really significant. I think there was one, at least, case of a recruiter who was beaten to death, several cases of recruiters' cars being set on fire, several cases of big groups of people, having a fight in the street with recruiters and chasing them away. And this is only going to rise as the situation at the front becomes worse and worse and worse, and people's faith in any aspect of their state just hits absolute rock bottom, and they're really just fighting to be allowed to stay alive.
Something else, few more minutes. Something else I want to ask you about. I recently read that the Russians have met with the government of Mali, and they said, basically, we're going to arm you. That the Russians are meeting with Sahel states. It certainly appears as though they're going to, again, they're starting to really get into the legacy of anti-imperialist work and the support of anti-imperialist imperialist elements around the world, meeting with Vietnam. They've been meeting with the Indonesians, a lot of stuff going on in Africa, North Korea. Putin used to be the Soviet Union. Anyone who says the infamous thing about anybody who wants to say bring it back or whatever doesn't have a brain. You've heard all of that. But the Russian government now seems to, in defense of their sovereignty, seems to be quite wise, and they seem to be reverting back to the legacy of anti-imperialist support around the world, particularly very, very much in Africa, very much in Asia. I suspect we see, by the way, the Russian Navy showing up in Cuba every couple of days here, Venezuela. Your thoughts on that anti-imperialist work, the importance of it, and what it means that they're starting to recognize that perhaps they went awry when they, went away from it for a while. Although they did have to build up internally. Anyway, I think that's an important conversation.
Yeah, you mean when they took the imperialists at their words and tried to be partners? For years and years and years, you'd listen to Vladimir Putin talking. And even as the West got progressively more hostile, he would always refer to the leaders of the West as, American partners, European partners. And sometimes you felt like hitting them on the head and saying, they're not your partners, mate. But after a while, you could tell that he knew they weren't too. But it was just a kind of diplomatic speak as they steadily made their moves towards becoming more resilient to the attacks of the West. But yes, there certainly was a very naive belief by the Russian bourgeoisie that if they just got rid of the socialist system that made them targeted by the West, we would all be friends together and equals. Because they stopped bloody studying imperialism. They stopped reading their own founder, Lenin, who could have explained to them that there's no equality under capitalism, and there's certainly no equality of nations under imperialism. And it's pie in the sky to imagine, that Russia is going to be allowed to join the imperialist club. You are going to be treated as a colony, and anything you do to try to have sovereignty is going to come up for major attack. And that is exactly what happened. The leaders of Russia were fated when they facilitated the recolonization of Russia and all the former Soviet territories, when they got up off their knees, stood up for their own national interests, tried to become sovereign and independent and equal. They were increasingly vilified and finally driven into a war. So there's no way to make imperialism be reasonable by behaving reasonably yourself. And that is something, that frustrated a lot of us observers for a long time, because China fell into the same patterns of trying to be reasonable and show the West, look, we're no threat to you. And the last time I wrote about this in my very little pamphlet on the drive to war against Russia and China some years ago, that I think that the key turning point for the world was Libya, because it was kind of the last time when Russia and China kind of stayed on the sidelines and kind of said, well, we're not interfering, it's not our business, we're no threat to you. They didn't want to be in the crosshairs. But of course, the disastrous results of letting the West loose on Africa's most prosperous country have been horrific, not only for Libya, but not even for the region, not even for Africa and the Middle East, but for the world. The the consequences have been catastrophic, and they didn't make Russia or China one bit more secure or respected by the West. Quite the reverse. It just that when the imperialists get away with one thing, they think they can get away with two more things, right? It's not like there's ever enough, just like there's never enough profit. It's not a reasonable system. It's not run on human logic. I always come back to, and I can never find it on the internet now, but I know I did not imagine this because there's no reason for me to have imagined it. I remember during fairly early days of the Bolivarian process, that was also fairly early days of the Iraq War, I remember Hugo Chavez saying that Latin America owed a debt of thanks to the Iraqi resistance because it was pinning down the imperialists, and in particular the US Army, to such an extent that it didn't have the ability to turn its full attention to the people of Latin America. And consequently, the kind of pink tide that was spreading across Latin America that time was able to make great strides on behalf of the people. And in particular, the Bolivarian process in Venezuela was able to bed in without the kind of resistance it could have expected if it was the only country that was doing something the USA didn't like. But because the US were bogged down in Iraq, and they were bogged down in Iraq because the Iraqi people fought tooth and nail against their invasion, against their occupation, it bogged down US forces, took up a huge amount of attention of US kind of foreign policy types and military. And that's a really important lesson. And I know it's probably boring, but I always also quote Che Guevara, who gave a speech, I think 1965, somewhere like that, to the Tricontinental when it was meeting in, I'm going to get it wrong if I say where I think it was. Anyway, a meeting of the Tricontinental. And he said, he was talking about what was going on in Vietnam. And he said, think what could be done to the imperialists if they had to deal with not one, but 2, 3, or many Vietnams. What he was saying is what we're seeing now. Yes, that the anti-imperialist forces are understanding that while the imperialists are bogged down, not just bogged down, but being militarily defeated, being actually disarmed by the process of their wars, most especially in Ukraine. And that's kind of why we almost say that the Ukraine war is the most important thing that's happening right now in the world, because it's sucking so many military resources. So much political and economic capital of the West is being sucked up by the proxy war in Ukraine against Russia. And that is enabling space to develop for other resistance movements. And I know you've talked about, Garland, the fact that, with so much going on in the Middle East now, and also in Ukraine, you can see that Africa is starting to have its moment. Haiti is, starting to feel like, actually, for all the US, we're just a small island. The US throws as many resources as they can at us. And yet there's like a space where revolution can develop, because they can't throw decisive amount of resources that they would like to. They've got too much tied up elsewhere. Even the proxy force they wanted to send from Kenya to Haiti, for example, that's going to come under pressure now with everything that's going on. There's revolution in the streets of Kenya right now, against this regime. Why? Because on the one hand, it wants to enact austerity measures on behalf of US imperialism as dictated by the IMF. And on the other hand, it's sending its troops to be the policemen of imperialism around the world, while those same type of policemen are cracking down on workers at home. They feel the ignominy of having a government like that that's in the pocket of the imperialists, that doesn't respond to the needs of the masses. And they look around what's happening in the rest of Africa and say, well, isn't it about time our liberation struggle was also completed? We had our flag. The Kenyan people fought so hard against British colonial occupation and the settler colonial state that was created in Kenya, the white settler colony that was planted there to be a bastion of British imperialism. Don't imagine that Israel is the only settler colonial state that the British ever set up, right? They got a big track record of that sort of thing. Many of them in Africa. The Kenyan people fought incredibly hard for their independence, and it turned hollow because the economic dominance of Britain that was then kind of usurped by the USA, although Britain is still a strong presence in Kenya, including it has a military presence there that people don't tend to know about. But that independence turned hollow. It didn't bring all the things it should have brought because they never had the true sovereignty to develop their country according to the needs of the people. And that pressure now to complete that struggle, you're seeing it, the wave of it sweeping across Africa. You're seeing it in South Africa expressing itself. You're seeing it expressing itself in Kenya. And of course, you're seeing it in the rise of the Sahel states, their increasing integration and cooperation. And then we come to this question of the anti-imperialist camp working together, not just kind of fortuitously by the fact that the imperialists are being held down by a group of anti-imperialist fighters somewhere else, and this is a good moment for us, but also in a very systematic way. And aren't the Russians lucky that they have this tremendous heritage of anti-imperialist solidarity to fall back on? So not only they have habits and customs that are deeply entrenched in their people and their institutions, they have decades or even century-old links across Africa, across the world, with national liberation struggles, with national movements, with anti-colonial movements, and with peoples. They have the love of peoples all over the world because of that. It's a love for the Soviet Union, in fact. It's a love for what the Soviet Union tried to do for people, how much it helped them with arms, with training, with ideological support, with every kind of thing, material, ideological, diplomatic. They gave all the support they possibly could have done. And the people knew that. And it was not a self-interested quid pro quo relationship. It was genuine solidarity. They did everything they could to help countries break out of the stranglehold of imperialist domination. And for all we can say that flag and anthem independence was not as good as real, true sovereign independence under a socialist government, it was a step forward. The reason being that once you don't have a physical colonial force, you have two things have changed. One is the colonizers, the imperialists, have to go on the back foot. They have to pretend to be in favor of democracy and the rule of law and people's self-government and all these kind of things. And okay, they might find mechanisms to disrupt those and to control them, but from behind the scenes. But these mechanisms become obvious to people and they know it's not right. The other thing that happens is the imperialists themselves have much more competition inside each colony or inside each territory, because the whole point of physical colonies and why the imperialists prefer physical colonies is that in a physically controlled colony, all the raw materials, all the resources, and all the access to the markets are your monopoly. You simply keep everybody else out. There's no competition. One of the reasons that monopoly leads to decay in terms of innovation is because as soon as you have a monopoly over a market, whether it's a physical market or the market for a certain type of goods that you've eliminated all the competition, then your need to keep innovating is gone. And in fact, what you end up doing is suppressing innovation because it's just going to cut into your profit. Why would you bother? The whole point of imperialism is to find ways to make super profits to keep the system going. Right? So physical colonies are preferred. Physical colonies allow you to have a total monopoly. You realize how this operates when you look at the history of British industry. You know, British industry for a long time had this huge market in Britain's colonial possessions. It was a guaranteed market with no competition from any other imperialist power. And because of that, British industry did not innovate for like 100 years. Even after World War II, British industry suddenly was exposed to the world market, and sphere after sphere went out of production, went bankrupt really, really quickly. Why? Because their machinery was Victorian. And no amount of working the people harder could make its productivity catch up with the innovative machinery in Germany or the United States or Japan in particular, right? So it was far, far behind technologically because it had had its monopoly of markets all this time. Now, why am I banging on about this? Because in relation to the colonial world, one of the things that changed in the neo-colonial period was in each former colony, now kind of neo-colony, there is competition between the imperialists for the market. They have to jostle with one another and fight with one another. And not only that, but that competition in the market also allows space for Russia or China, who are not imperialists, but do produce things that people need. And China in particular, of course, is the workshop of the world today. And it produces things of a very high quality, which are very, very cheap, right? And in an open market competition without physical colonial control, the Chinese are undercutting the imperialists all around the world, and in a very good way, right? They're loosening the stranglehold, and they are making even some leaders who had been total toadies of and mouthpieces for imperialism start to get quite independent-minded. They're like, oh, maybe we don't have to. You know, in so many countries after World War II, it seemed to people that they didn't really have a choice about towing the line to the USA because, or Britain, but particularly the USA, they're so strong economically, they're so strong militarily, they control the world economic levers. If you don't go full socialist and cut yourself off from the world market by having a self-contained planned economy, if you try to do a mixed economy or a kind of people-leaning market economy, the USA can strangle you. And it became sort of self-evident to a lot of countries that you've got to keep in with the USA or you'll be stuffed, right? They've got all the ability. And I think this brings us back to your initial question that over all this time, people have learned some really important lessons. You know, what's the imperialist approach? Divide and rule. You know, what have they done with sanctions? They've tried to isolate countries. And part of the way they isolate them is they conduct huge hysterical propaganda campaigns against them, make up all kinds of narratives that present their governments as crazy, mad, untouchables. And with their control of mass media all around the world and the fact that everybody seems to agree with these narratives, they are able to justify in the eyes of the world isolating and strangling countries one by one, you know, North Korea, Venezuela, Cuba, one by one by one. The problem is, in recent times, they've tried to add into this list of small and weak economies, Iran, China and Russia. What did that do? What was the result of that? That has flipped totally back on themselves. These are not tiny, small countries unable to defend themselves. Having tried their best, both of them, to be reasonable and find sensible ways out of, you know, this zero-sum game that they don't really want to participate in. They're like, well, we don't really want to live in a zero-sum world. We're not trying to dominate anyone. We're just trying to live. Can't we just all get along? Can't we just negotiate? Can't we just find a settlement that addresses all of our needs? You know, and they use this human logic of course, to imperialists who are incapable of responding to it. So after a while, they get the message and say, well, you know what? The answer to imperialist divide and rule is united we stand. And in the end, the coming together of the anti-imperialist camp that we're seeing now is, I think, it's the story of our time, and it shows you the picture of where the world is going.
Joti Brar, where can everybody find you online?
Thank you. So I have a Telegram channel, that's just my name, Joti Brar. My party's website is thecommunists.org. Please do visit that and sign up for our newsletter. We have also The Communists is also our Telegram channel as a party. You can find us on Twitter, but, you know, I tend to say to people, don't bother because the algorithms, the shadow banning and all of that. We have a YouTube channel. Again, I think a lot of our subscribers don't see our content unless they specifically go looking for it, but we are there, Prol TV, and there's a lot of amazing content there on Prol TV. Anyone who's really interested in understanding what is this Marxism this woman keeps banging on about, you know, there's a huge amount of fantastic material on our channel. You can really get a decent grounding in Marxist education if you go to our website and if you go to Prol TV and take a look there.
Thank you very much, Joti Brar. Everyone, don't forget, as you probably know, the great free speech leader, and the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, is 100% joined with the imperialists on at the hip when it comes to going after Venezuela, if you've been focusing lately. So needless to say, you ain't finding me on Twitter. Well, you can find, I'll put it like this. You can get to my Twitter, what is it? Not channel, but my Twitter page, but I can't. So at any rate, make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. And of course, Joti and I, even if they share it, it's going to be shadow banned to some extent. You may be also, but the more they can't shadow ban all of us. How's that? So everyone, make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. Follow Joti on social media. Follow her, especially on Telegram. It doesn't seem to have the algorithms of the rest. And thank you very much. Joti Brar, thank you. And we will see you again. Well, next week I will be out of town, but we will the week after.